During June 1974, a compact team of American representatives traveled to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. There were no recording devices, no media briefings, no public declarations. However, the confidential arrangement they negotiated would establish how the planet purchases petroleum, how nations fund their obligations, and how a single currency achieved dominance over international commerce for the subsequent 5 decades. This represents the narrative of the petrodollar mechanism and why its continuation is currently facing significant uncertainty. To comprehend what transpired in 1974, we must first go back 3 years. For almost 3 decades following World War II, the worldwide economy possessed a robust foundation. The US dollar was supported by gold at an established rate of $35 per ounce, and every other significant currency was linked to the dollar. This was the Bretton Woods framework, and it established the dollar as the foundation of the planet. However, by the late 1960s, the US faced difficulties. Enormous expenditure on the Vietnam conflict and social initiatives meant it was manufacturing more currency than it possessed gold to support it. Other nations grew anxious and began exchanging their dollars for gold, depleting America's stockpiles. Therefore, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a startling declaration. The United States would cease converting dollars to gold. Instantly, the Bretton Woods framework was terminated. The dollar transformed into a fiat currency, supported not by precious metal, but merely by confidence in the U.S. administration. That confidence was promptly tested. Between 1971 and 1973, the dollar's valuation collapsed. Inflation surged. Foreign financial institutions were holding enormous quantities of dollars with no obvious substitute, but their confidence was diminishing rapidly. Then arrived the petroleum crisis. In October 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Nations, announced an oil embargo against the U.S. for its assistance of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Petroleum prices quadrupled within months. By the period the embargo concluded in March 1974, the harm was inflicted. The United States was managing challenges in both energy availability and the stability of its currency. OPEC countries, headed by Saudi Arabia, now controlled all leverage. They regulated a resource the planet couldn't function without, and they were genuinely questioning why they should continue selling it for a currency that was weakening daily. This represents the turbulent context for that confidential journey to Saudi Arabia during summer 1974. The American delegation was headed by Treasury Secretary William Simon. His group included senior representatives from the Treasury and State Departments. Their objective was to persuade the Saudis, specifically King Faisal and his finance minister, to rescue the dollar. The negotiations weren't a singular gathering, but a sequence of discreet conversations over multiple weeks. No official agreement was ever documented, but what developed was a quiet arrangement with 3 fundamental components. First, Saudi Arabia consented to price all of its petroleum exports exclusively in US dollars and utilize its influence to convince other OPEC participants to follow suit. Second, in exchange, the United States committed to supply military assistance and security assurances to safeguard the Saudi kingdom and its extensive oil reserves. Third, and this was the brilliant maneuver, Saudi Arabia would reinvest a substantial portion of its petroleum revenues back into US Treasury securities. This established a flawless cycle. Oil revenues or petrodollars would exit the planet's economies to purchase oil and then return directly into the US financial apparatus. Declassified records later revealed the Saudis were reluctant. They insisted that their investments remain confidential and that the US guarantee not to immobilize their holdings. The Treasury consented, even establishing a distinct accounting mechanism to conceal the magnitude of Saudi possessions from the public. The arrangement was maintained quietly for a purpose. For the Saudis, it would appear like they were instruments of Washington. For the Americans, it was an acknowledgement that their currency was now reliant on the collaboration of a foreign authority. However, the arrangement was genuine and it functioned brilliantly. So, how precisely does this petrodollar mechanism operate? It's actually quite straightforward. When a nation like Japan or Germany desires to purchase petroleum from Saudi Arabia, they cannot compensate in yen or euros. They must compensate in US dollars. This signifies they initially need to acquire dollars on the foreign exchange marketplace, generating a continuous artificial requirement for the currency that has nothing to do with American products or services. This continuous requirement has enormous consequences. It establishes the dollar as the planet's reserve currency. Currently, approximately 88% of all international transactions are conducted in dollars, even when the US isn't participating. It also provides the United States what some describe as an exorbitant advantage. Petroleum exporting countries end up with mountains of dollars and they require a secure location to deposit that cash. US Treasury securities are the most rational selection because they're stable and simple to purchase and liquidate. Saudi Arabia alone maintains over $100 billion in these securities. This recycling of petrodollars signifies the US government possesses a guaranteed purchaser for its obligations. It can maintain huge budget shortfalls year after year, funding its expenditure by selling securities that nations like Saudi Arabia are essentially obligated to purchase. The mechanism is strengthened by military capability. The US sustains installations across the Middle East, sells sophisticated weaponry to the Saudis, and safeguards the transportation routes that carry the petroleum. In return, the Gulf states maintain the dollar's position not because of an agreement, but because their objectives are synchronized. It's not a conspiracy theory. The consequences of the petrodollar arrangement became apparent almost immediately. By late 1975, the dollar had stabilized. While inflation was still elevated, the currency emergency that had been threatening America's financial reputation was concluded. The Federal Reserve, under Arthur Burns, could finally concentrate on domestic strategy without perpetually worrying about foreign nations abandoning their dollars. OPEC's choice to continue pricing petroleum in dollars also discouraged other suppliers from experimenting with alternative currencies. Once the Saudis were participating, the remainder of the marketplace simply conformed. Petroleum became equivalent with dollars on international agreements, transportation documents, and futures exchanges. The influx of petrodollars into U.S. financial markets had even larger consequences. It expanded the Treasury marketplace, which reduced borrowing expenses for the U.S. government and made deficit funding politically much simpler. Between 1974 and 1980, foreign possessions of U.S. Treasury securities more than doubled, and a substantial portion of that expansion originated from petroleum exporting countries. This financial buffer allowed the United States to pursue its foreign strategy objectives without immediate budget difficulties. Military operations, foreign assistance, and defense expansions could be funded with borrowed capital instead of elevated taxes. The political expense of overseas obligations decreased because the economic expense was distributed among global creditors. However, simultaneously, developing nations without petroleum reserves discovered themselves with a new difficulty. They required dollars not just to exchange with the U.S., but to purchase energy. This elevated demand for dollar-denominated credits, often from Western financial institutions with variable interest percentages. When the Federal Reserve dramatically raised interest percentages in the early 1980s to combat inflation, many of these nations couldn't manage to reimburse their obligations. The consequence was the Latin American debt emergency, which destabilized economies from Mexico to Argentina. The petrodollar mechanism had obvious winners and losers, and the United States was the principal winner. Over the subsequent few decades, the petrodollar arrangement expanded from a straightforward arrangement into the very foundation of U.S. financial capability. Because every nation required dollars to purchase petroleum, central banks throughout the planet began maintaining huge dollar stockpiles, far more than they would require just for exchanging with the U.S. This massive continuous requirement for dollars established it as the planet's primary reserve currency. According to the International Monetary Fund, the dollar still comprises approximately 59% of worldwide foreign exchange stockpiles, even though the U.S. economy represents only about 25% of worldwide GDP. This unique position provides the United States what economists describe as an exorbitant advantage. The U.S. government can secure capital at reduced interest percentages than other nations. It can maintain massive trade shortfalls year after year without generating a financial emergency, and it can utilize the dollar's central function as a powerful instrument of foreign strategy. Financial penalties are the most evident illustration because international financial institutions depend on dollar clearing mechanisms to finalize transactions. The US Treasury can effectively isolate nations or individuals from the complete worldwide financial apparatus. This capability has been utilized against administrations in Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and North Korea. The penalties function because those nations can't easily perform international exchange without obtaining access to dollar markets. The military aspect of the arrangement also expanded deeper. U.S. security obligations in the Gulf expanded beyond just Saudi Arabia to include Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is stationed in Bahrain. Air installations in Qatar support activities across the Middle East, and weapon transactions to Gulf nations